11. Federal Indian boarding schools and the Native Hawaiian community. The Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative investigation demonstrates that missionaries, the Kingdom of Hawaii, and the individual Native Hawaiian monarchs and royalty established boarding schools to educate Native Hawaiian children, including for assimilation and retention of culture. Some boarding schools operated throughout the Kingdom of Hawaii, Republic of Hawaii, Territory of Hawaii, and State of Hawaii. The investigation shows that between 1819 to 1969, the United States supported approximately 7 boarding schools in Hawaii. Note, an individual federal Indian boarding school may account for multiple sites. The political relationship between the United States and the Native Hawaiian community has been recognized and reaffirmed by the United States. The United States has acknowledged that Native Hawaiians are a distinct and unique indigenous people with a historical continuity to the original inhabitants of the Hawaiian archipelago, whose society was organized as a nation and internationally recognized as a nation by the United States, Britain, France, and Japan, as evidenced by treaties governing friendship, commerce, and navigation. Over nearly a century, Congress has determined repeatedly through a body of legislation that the Native Hawaiian community is within the scope of federal powers over Indian affairs, and with which the United States has already recognized an inherent special political and trust relationship. Under its powers over Indian affairs, the U.S. federal government in Native Hawaiian relations directed and supported land acquisition and Native Hawaiian assimilation through education simultaneously. The United States has concluded that at the time of European arrival to the Hawaiian Islands, in 1778, the Native Hawaiian people lived in a highly organized, self-sufficient, subsistence social system based on a communal land tenure system with a sophisticated language, culture, and religion. In 1795, the Kingdom of Hawaii developed as an absolute monarchy, and a unified monarchical government of the Hawaiian Islands was established in 1810 under Kamehameha I, the first king of Hawaii. The 1800s are a story of increasing involvement of Westerners in the economic and political affairs of the kingdom. The United States has acknowledged rights to land became a principal concern, and there was unremitting pressure to allow non-Hawaiians to use and to own land and to be secure in their title. From 1820 to 1850, the kingdom transformed the communal land tenure system to a private land ownership system, following pressure from the United States and European nations, which wanted stable land ownership to permit long-term leasing and outright land ownership for large-scale agricultural ventures. At the same time, non-federal entities supported assimilation of Native Hawaiians. Between 1819 and 1847, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, which received federal support through the Indian Civilization Fund Act of 1819, sent 12 missionary companies to Hawaii to promote Calvinism and claimed civilized practices. ABC-FM mandated the first company as follows: "You are to aim at nothing short of covering those islands with fruitful field and pleasant dwellings, and schools and churches, and of raising up a whole people to an elevated state of Christian civilization." The missionaries built schools to reduce the Native Hawaiian language to writing, teach Native Hawaiians to read and write, and promote Christian conversation. As the U.S. Supreme Court has noted, they sought to teach Hawaiians to abandon religious beliefs and customs that were contrary to Christian teachings and practices. Soon after, in 1826, Kahumanu, the Queen Regent, negotiated the first treaty with the United States, settling debts and granting it permission to use Hawaiian ports. As Congress has proclaimed, between 1826 to 1893, the United States recognized the sovereignty and independence of the Kingdom of Hawaii, extended full and complete diplomatic recognition to the Kingdom of Hawaii, and entered into treaties and conventions with the Kingdom of Hawaii to govern friendship, commerce, and navigation in 1826, 1842, 1849, 1875, and 1887. By the end of the 1820s, the majority of the adult Native Hawaiian population attended missionary schools. The missionaries in 1831 then established a teacher training school at Lahainaluna, Maui. The Lahainaluna Seminary trained young Native Hawaiians to teach other Native Hawaiians to read, write, and embrace Christianity. In 1834, the school began to accept boarding students. The missionaries in 1834 also supplied a printing press and printed school primers, catechism, and the Bible in Hawaii for distribution among newly literate Native Hawaiians. In 1836, the missionaries formed the Hilo Boarding School for Native Hawaiian male children. From the first, religious instruction, practical farming, and the mechanical skills of the time were dominating elements of the curriculum. The charter of the Hilo Boarding School, created in 1848, required schooling of Native Hawaiian male children in the various branches of Christian living and teaching of sound, useful knowledge, coupled with manual labor to promote good citizenship training. The department has described that the school served well in the early days in educating leaders among the Hawaiian race, producing what was most needed among them: teachers, preachers, and intelligent agriculturists and homemakers. The department has also assessed the connections between other boarding schools. The Hilo Boarding School served as a feeder for Lahainaluna Seminary, which was then a higher school for the training of native preachers and missionaries. For operation, the Hilo Boarding School relied on student manual labor, including for agriculture. As such, it was cautious to admit male children younger than age 10 or 12. It has always been predominantly an industrial school, and the labor of the pupils themselves has been a large factor in building up the plant, developing the farm, and maintaining the subsistence department. In 1900, the Hilo Boarding School established a pupil government, including a judiciary body composed of child magistrates to distribute penalties to other children for school regulation violations and military discipline. In 1910, the school instituted a military regimen, including uniforms, drills, and rifles. As the department has acknowledged, the Hilo Boarding School is conducted largely on a military basis, drill instruction, and daily routine being made regular features of the boys' life in the school. The military regimen proves to be of great assistance in the formation of right habits and ideals. It is a most important aid in maintaining good discipline and morale and instilling loyalty to the school and the nation. The daily schedule of the Hilo Boarding School remained largely unchanged from its opening to its closing as a school in 1925. Original records document the daily schedule as follows: 5:20 a.m. Rising bell, 5:35 to 6:25 study hour, 6:30 breakfast, 7 to 8:20 work hour, 8:20 dispensary, 8:40 inspection of rooms, 8:50 to noon school, noon to 1 lunch, 1 to 4 work hour or shop, 4:15 to 5:15 drill Tuesdays, 5:45 supper, 7:15 chapel, 7:20 to 8:30 study hour, 8:45 p.m. taps. On Sundays, the male children were permitted to rise at 7 a.m. The newly educated teachers from Lahainaluna Seminary and Hilo Boarding School were charged to establish new mission schools throughout the Hawaiian Islands. In 1840, King Kamehameha III developed a Bill of Rights providing for a Hawaii-based public school system, making education a kingdom responsibility instead of a missionary one. By 1848, over 200 schools operated in the Kingdom of Hawaii. King Kamehameha III also created the Chief's Children's School, also known as the Royal School, to train future monarchs of the Kingdom of Hawaii. Maintained by missionaries, Native Hawaiian children were segregated by gender in the school, which was a change from Native Hawaiian culture and practices, and disciplinary practices included food denial and corporal punishment. When we thought the case demanded it, we have not hesitated to use the rod, taking them alone and conversing with them a while before we applied it, and the result has generally been a happy one. The department has recognized that by 1850, the well-being of Native Hawaiians was diminishing. With the rapid development of the sugar industry, which set in strongly about the middle of the 18th century, and in view of the steadily and rapidly decreasing native population, it became evident that a supply of new and cheap labor must be found. So her own people could once again thrive, the last direct descendant of King Kamehameha I, Princess Bernice Pauahi Bishop, in 1883, left her estate in trust for a school dedicated to the education and upbringing of native Hawaiians. Princess Bernice Pauahi Bishop's will provided for the construction and maintenance of 2 schools, each for boarding and day scholars, one for boys and one for girls, in the Hawaiian Islands, called the Kamehameha Schools, on the Hawaiian monarchy's ancestral lands, with purpose of providing a good education in the common English branches and also instruction in morals and in such useful knowledge as may tend to make good and industrious men and women. In 1888, the Kamehameha School for Boys incorporated a military training program, which the War Department recognized as a military school in 1910. Between 1916 and 2002, under the National Defense Act, Kamehameha School participated in the Reserve Officers Training Corps and Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps programs. From 1935 to the early months of World War II, the United States recruited attendees and graduates of the Kamehameha School for Boys to colonize the Howland, Baker, and Jarvis Islands, first through the Department of Commerce until jurisdiction was transferred to the department. The Kamehameha School continues to benefit Native Hawaiian education today. Although the Alolo, Hawaii-based public school system initially operated using only the Hawaiian language, it eventually repressed Alolo Hawaii in education by promoting English. By 1888, only 16% of children were taught in Hawaiian. In 1891, when crowned, Queen Liliuokalani advanced the kingdom, seeking to reduce control and influence by U.S. and European sugar planters, missionaries, and business interests over it. Then, as the United States has recognized, in 1893, the sovereign, independent, internationally recognized, and indigenous government of Hawaii, the Kingdom of Hawaii, was overthrown by a small group of non-Hawaiians, including United States citizens, who were assisted in their efforts by the United States Minister, a United States Naval Representative, and armed naval forces of the United States. As President Cleveland noted, it appears that Hawaii was taken possession of by the United States forces without the consent or wish of the government of the islands, or of anybody else, so far as shown, except the United States Minister. United States agents and citizens participated in deposing Queen Liliuokalani, and non-native Hawaiians established a Republic of Hawaii in 1894. The United States has further recognized the resulting deliberate policy to suppress Olelo Hawaii. Following the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii in 1893, Hawaiian medium schools were banned. After annexation throughout the territorial and statehood period of Hawaii, and until 1986, use of the Hawaiian language as an instructional medium in education in public schools was declared unlawful. The declaration caused incalculable harm to a culture that placed a very high value on the power of language, as exemplified in the traditional saying, "In the language rests life, in the language rests death." For over a century, the various governments controlling the Hawaiian Islands banned Alolo Hawaii and required the use of English language in public education, coinciding with additional land acquisition by the United States of the Hawaiian Islands. As the United States codified in 1898, the Joint Resolution to provide for annexing the Hawaiian Islands to the United States ceded absolute title of all lands held by the Republic of Hawaii, including the government and crown lands of the former Kingdom of Hawaii, to the United States, totaling 1.8 million acres. The joint resolution notably mandated that revenue generated from the lands be used solely for the benefit of the inhabitants of the Hawaiian Islands for educational and other public purposes. The United States, in turn, officially supported Native Hawaiian education prior to Hawaii's status as a U.S. territory and state. Congress in 1900 enacted the Hawaiian Organic Act, establishing the territory of Hawaii, extending the U.S. Constitution to Hawaii, placing ceded lands under federal control, and directing the use of proceeds from those lands to benefit the inhabitants of Hawaii. By 1902, the territory replaced the Alolo Hawaii-based public school system with 203 English-required schools and instituted discipline practices for speaking Alolo Hawaii. The extraordinary feature of the Hawaiian Educational Plan is that, in a land far removed in the Pacific, it did become typically American, and that the transformation was achieved even before the islands themselves became American soil. In 1959, when the United States admitted the state of Hawaii into the Union, it also reaffirmed the trust relationship between the United States and the Native Hawaiian community. It did so in part by retaining exclusive power to enforce the Ceded Land Trust and Hawaiian Homelands Trust, including to ensure proceeds from the sale or other disposition of any such lands and the income therefrom shall be held by the state as a public trust for the support of the public schools and other public education institutions for the betterment of the conditions of Native Hawaiians. The United States, therefore, officially supported Native Hawaiian education following the statehood of Hawaii. After statehood of Hawaii, the United States, as part of Native Hawaiian relations, also supported established missionary and other boarding schools for Native Hawaiians. The Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative investigation shows that between 1819 to 1969, the United States supported approximately 7 boarding schools in the Hawaiian Islands. Note: an individual federal Indian boarding school may account for multiple sites, and an institution primarily operated or supported by a non-federal entity could qualify as a federal Indian boarding school if the institution met all 4 required criteria as described in the sections entitled Executive Summary and Developing the Indian Boarding School List. The department has identified the following federal Indian boarding schools in the Hawaiian Islands: Hilo Boarding School, Industrial and Reformatory School, Kauelu, Industrial and Reformatory School, Kianula, Industrial and Reformatory School, Waiali, Industrial and Reformatory School, Waiali, Industrial and Reformatory School for Girls, Kianula, Industrial and Reformatory School for Girls, Maunawili, Industrial and Reformatory School for Girls, Honolulu, Kamehameha Schools, Lahaina Luna Seminary, Mauna Loa Forestry Camp School, Molokai Forestry Camp School. Today, the United States has held that the long-standing policy of the United States has been to protect and advance Native Hawaiian interests. Native Hawaiians continue to suffer the consequences of the 1893 overthrow of their indigenous government, including higher poverty rates and lower incomes than non-Native Hawaiians in Hawaii. As Congress expressed in the joint resolution to acknowledge the 100th anniversary of the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii, a commitment to acknowledge the ramifications of past federal actions is necessary to provide the proper foundation and reconciliation between the United States and the Native Hawaiian community. The Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative provides a proper first step for intergenerational healing from the effects of federal Indian boarding schools in the Native Hawaiian community.